DPM Lawrence Wong.
Mr. Speaker, I thank all members who have spoken on the bill. There were broadly two categories of questions. The first relates to the technical and operational aspects of the GST regime. I think not so many people spoke about that. But the other set of questions relates to the GST increase itself, which many more members spoke about. But let me first address the technical and operational clarifications. Mr. Derek Goh suggested that we do more to help small businesses register for GST voluntarily. I completely agree, and we will do more. Today, 7 in 10 businesses that newly register for GST already do so voluntarily. So we will continue to help businesses who wish to register for GST to do so, and there are support schemes under Enterprise Singapore for this purpose, and we will do more to engage SMEs on this. On the GST transitional rules, Mr. Saktiandi Supat was concerned that smaller businesses might find it difficult to understand these rules. And again, we have likewise, we share the concerns. We've been very mindful of their needs, and that's why since early this year, IRAS has been helping businesses prepare for the GST rate change by conducting monthly live webinars, publishing e-tax guides and FAQs on its website, as well as launching a YouTube video. And businesses that require more clarifications on the transitional rules can approach IRAS for more assistance. Mr. Saktiandi also asked how offenders will be prosecuted differently under the new Missing Trader Fraud Section 62C. Currently, perpetrators of missing trader fraud can only be prosecuted under non-tax acts like the Companies Act. But as I mentioned just now, these provisions may not be able to cater to the specificities of missing trader fraud, which is a very complex tax crime. And therefore, Section 62C addresses this by introducing a new two-tiered approach to prosecute offenders based on their level of culpability and through enhanced penalties. Providing for this under the GST Act will also empower IRAS to investigate and prosecute these offences more effectively. And as Mr. Louis Ng highlighted, there is a clear distinction in the penalties between tiers 1 and 2. The distinction between these tiers is based on the presence of criminal intent, where a person knows or has reasonable grounds to believe that his participation is for a fraudulent purpose. He will be prosecuted under tier 1, regardless of whether he has full oversight of the entire operation. Where there is no such criminal intent and yet a person's business entity is eventually used in a specified arrangement, he will face the lesser strict liability charge under Tier 2. This will apply when business owners do not exercise a reasonable care and due diligence expected of them. Establishing criminal intent, like for all criminal offences, is a question of fact that will need to be proven in court, and the eventual sentencing of cases will be determined by the courts. IRAS has provided guidance on its website and through an e-tax guide on how businesses can avoid being drawn into a missing trader fraud arrangement. And whistleblowers who report such fraud to IRAS may also receive rewards under IRAS's whistleblower program if conditions are met. So these are the technical and operational issues which I hope I have clarified. Next, let me move on to the questions on the GST rate increase itself. Members, from the speeches I've heard, broadly agree that our structural needs are rising and we do need to raise the revenues to fund them. The key issues are how we go about doing so, and these issues can be summarized into two broad questions. Why raise the GST now? And two, why not alternatives to the GST? So let me take them in turn. First, why raise the GST now? I fully understand and appreciate members' concerns about doing so at such a challenging economic environment. This was a very difficult decision for me and the MOF team. We had considered this very carefully, leading up to the budget, as I explained in the budget speech and in our budget debates, and subsequently even after the budget when we saw conditions deteriorating. But eventually, we decided that it was still necessary to move. For now, our economy and labor market are still holding steady Our GDP growth is projected to come in at 3 to 4% this year. Our resident unemployment rate has also recovered to pre-pandemic levels. Sectors such as aviation and tourism that were badly affected by the pandemic are continuing to recover. There are some indications of weaker growth in some sectors, and we are monitoring this closely. More importantly, the economic challenges we face are not just near-term or cyclical in nature. The ongoing war in Ukraine, disruptions to energy and food supplies, as well as rising geopolitical tensions and more fragmented supply chains. These are the realities we have to deal with, not just in the near term, but very possibly for a more prolonged period. In other words, international economic conditions have fundamentally changed. While we expect inflationary pressures in Singapore to ease in the second half of next year, according to MAS's latest forecast, inflation rates are unlikely to go back to what they were over the past decade. Both globally and in Singapore, the new normal may well be a higher rate of inflation than what we were used to. And that's why where inflation is concerned, the government has extended comprehensive support to Singaporeans, especially lower and middle income families, through 3 packages this year, totaling more than $3.5 billion. On average, as I have explained, these measures will fully offset the inflation-driven increases in spending for lower income and retiree households, fully offset the increase in spending for low-income and retiree households due to inflation. For the typical middle-income household, the government support provided will offset more than half of the inflation-driven increases in cost of living this year. So if you take the example of a middle-income family, which I think Mr. Louis Chua highlighted just now in his speech, inflation is coming in at 6% this year. Their annual expenditure will go up by, Mr. Louis Chua estimated, around 2,700. Our estimates are not very different. So yes, there is an increase in spending because of inflation, but the support that they are getting this year is around 1,500. So it will again keep to our commitment to offset more than half of the inflation-driven increase in cost of living this year for middle-income households. And this does not take into account wage increases for individuals, many of whom are very likely to enjoy. This is what we are doing this year. Next year, we will continue to monitor closely the inflation situation, and we will assess what additional support measures might be needed. At the same time, we will press ahead with our economic restructuring and transformation plans. Because when we make ourselves more productive and competitive, our workers will be able to earn more, and this can more than make up for the higher prices and ensure that we are better off in real terms. Mr. Saktiandi asked if the GST rate increase is the right macroeconomic stance to adopt in the face of higher inflation and a slowing economy. Sir, in calendar year 2023, the additional GST support going to households is expected to be comparable to the additional GST revenue we receive. We have designed our assistance packages to start flowing support early, ahead of the GST rate increase. As a result, the combined impact of the GST increase and the offset schemes we have put in place is broadly fiscally neutral. Furthermore, we are targeting our support at the lower to middle income households rather than doing it in a broad-based manner. So this will minimize any additional inflationary pressures. In sum, we have designed the overall package to ensure we neither stoke inflation inadvertently nor choke aggregate demand. And this is an appropriate macroeconomic stance to adopt at this juncture. Associate Professor James Lim cited what happened in Japan when they increased the GST rate as a warning of what might happen. But surely, as a professional economist, Professor Lim must know better. Context matters. Japan was in a deflationary environment. They raised GST and their inflation doubled, yes, but from a chronically low 1% to 2%, and even then temporarily. So let's avoid raising these alarmist examples that may not be so relevant to our context. Does that mean there's nothing to learn from overseas? No, we must continue to learn from countries' experience. But let's make sure we get the right lessons. In fact, there are no end of international examples, including recent ones, where governments have weakened their foundations of their fiscal system and they have ended up paying a very major price. So let's never, ever be tempted to go down that route. While there are considerable uncertainties in the economic outlook, there is certainly nothing uncertain about government expenditures, especially in the area of healthcare, which many members have cited, including Mr. Liang Eng-hwa, Mr. Sharil Taha, and Ms. Joan Pereira. Our population is aging with every passing year. Government support and spending on healthcare has been rising over the past decade, tripling from $3.7 billion in FY 2010 to $11.3 billion in FY 2019. And since then, we have continued to age, and our healthcare needs have become only more acute. I've said this before, we expect our healthcare spending, government's healthcare spending, to go up from 2.2% of GDP to 3.5% of GDP. That's 1.3% of GDP, much more than the revenues we get from the GST increase. And this is on healthcare alone. So even as we deal with healthcare spending, we have to resource many other spending needs. For example, we want to invest more in early childhood education to give every child the best start in life. And annual spending there is expected to double to over $2 billion in the next few years. We also want to do more to uplift our lower wage workers. Surely there is unanimous agreement in this House to do more here. Mr. Desmond Chu and Ms. Yeo Wan Ling spoke passionately about this, and I assure them this is a key priority for the government. That's why I had announced in the budget that we will be spending over $9 billion over the next 5 years on the enhanced workfare and the progressive wage credit scheme. And I also announced further enhancements to the progressive wage credit scheme earlier this year. We will continue to monitor the progress of our efforts to uplift the wages of lower wage workers, and we stand ready to do more if needed. Ms. Yeo also highlighted concerns about SMEs and self-employed persons, and we are also looking at how we can do more to help them. Today, public housing is a key concern for many, and we are ramping up our BTO supply to ensure accessibility and affordability of public housing, to address the backlogs due to COVID amid higher construction costs, and all that will again cost more. We also need to spend more to strengthen our social compact. This is an exercise we are undertaking now through the Forward Singapore conversations, and we are considering further policy shifts to do more for disadvantaged and vulnerable groups. And these moves will certainly require additional resources. So healthcare already, you can see where the spending needs are going to be. It's very clear because of the aging population, and you add up all of these other needs. It's a few billion here, a few billion there. They all add up. None of these needs have become less urgent because of the global economic situation. On the contrary, we must do more, especially in an uncertain and volatile environment. So if we don't deal with this huge spending gap now and decisively, the problem will only snowball, and very soon we will ourselves be unable to fund programs that Singaporeans need. That's why, having considered this so carefully before the budget, after the budget, even in the last few months when the global economic environment had deteriorated, we felt that there was no possibility for us to delay the GST increase any further. But what we can and what we will do is to delay the impact of the GST increase. That's done through the assurance package for the majority of Singaporean households for at least 5 years. And in the meantime, as members noted, we can then start to benefit from the recovery in tourism and collect more GST from tourists and foreigners and those who are better off. That's the reason why we are doing it like that, because people say, forget your assurance package. I don't do the assurance package, don't do GST, we square off and you just do GST later. But don't forget, when we do it the way we have designed, revenues start flowing in. From who? From foreigners, from the better off people, from tourists. So we are already getting benefits from revenue sources from these groups through the way we have designed the system. Mr. Saktiandi Supat also asked whether we would proceed with the GST increase, the second step of the GST rate increase, if there were a sharp deterioration in the economic conditions next year, like a major global downturn. If indeed such downside risk were to materialize and our economy is severely impacted, we will need to take a careful review and we will consider whether to proceed with the second step of the increase in 2024. For now, this is not our baseline expectations. Barring a severe downturn in global economic circumstances, we will proceed with the second step of the increase to put our public finances on a much stronger footing, and we will ensure that households are well supported through the transition. Next, let me talk on the second set of questions around why not consider alternatives to the GST. And here, several alternatives were offered. Associate Professor James Lim and Mr. Louis Chua suggested that there was fiscal surplus or fiscal slack which would enable us to delay the GST. I wish that were so. I wish that were so. But unfortunately, we do not have any surplus. Mr. Associate Professor James Lim said that the government is shielded from inflation because when inflation goes up and prices are higher, we will automatically collect more revenues in nominal terms. Well, he is right. But don't forget, and he didn't mention this, government spending must also go up correspondingly. Public servant salaries must go up, surely. Are we not to deny them wage increases? Support schemes must go up, surely, to keep pace with inflation. So on both sides, yes, we may collect more in nominal terms, but we will also have to spend more. In FY 2021, we did enjoy higher than expected revenue, and we had a surplus of $1.9 billion in FY 2021. But we have already used this surplus, as well as the better than expected fiscal outturn for the first half of FY 2022 to fund the June and October support packages this year. At this stage, it is still too early to determine the eventual fiscal outturn for the second half of FY 2022. But for now, we are not expecting a surplus for the year. And we will provide a firmer update, of course, at next year's budget. But the bottom line is, any surpluses that you can think of are imaginary. They are not there and will not allow us to delay the GST. The second set of suggestions of alternatives are largely to use more from the past reserves. And there you have different variants, including tweaking the formula for NIRC from 50% to 60%, or changing the definition of land sales revenues so that all the revenue from land sold attributable to the first 10 years of lease goes into current reserves as opposed to past reserves. Basically, whichever the suggestion, the point is these suggestions are asking the government to use more from the past reserves. That's what it comes down to. The Workers' Party have said that what they are suggesting is not to raid the past reserves, but it's really just to slow down the accumulation in reserves. It sounds very attractive, but it essentially means that we are leaving our next generation with fewer resources. And this will just make it harder for them to meet future needs at a time when things are going to be more challenging, as Ms. Foo Mee Har and many others have highlighted. At a time when our economy will be maturing, our population will be aging rapidly, and the uncertainties in the world are only becoming greater and greater. Surely, this cannot be the responsible thing to do. So let's not succumb to the temptation of taking this easy way out and making things worse for our children and grandchildren. In any case, as Mr. Derek Goh has highlighted, the growth of the reserves is already expected to slow given the significant headwinds in the global investment environment. long-term structural changes that we can see happening in the world, including the rise in geopolitical tensions, climate change, aging populations, lower productivity growth. All this will affect future long-term returns. Geopolitical tensions in particular might not only reduce investment returns, but could even result in conflict or war, which can impact the value of our investments. Mr. Derek Goh had asked about the process to determine the long-term expected real rate of return given these structural trends. And I assure him that we have a robust process in place. Basically, before the start of each financial year, the investment entities, MAS, GIC, and Temasek will calculate the expected long-term real rate of return for the assets they each manage. This has to be certified by their respective boards. And then they will submit it to the government. The government will take these inputs to propose the overall long-term expected real rate of return to the President. The President will consult with the Council of Presidential Advisors before deciding whether to agree with the government's proposal. So it's a very robust system with a few layers of checks in place. Now, given the trends that we expect over the coming years, it may well be that the expected long-term returns will have to come down, just based on these professional inputs and the assessment of these structural challenges we face. And if so, the right approach, and certainly the approach that the government will take, is to accept the lower NIRC and either adjust our spending accordingly, or we will have to find other forms of revenue. So that's the second broad range of suggestions to use more from the past reserves. I heard just now from Associate Professor James Lim a third area of suggestion, which is to fine-tune the GST system to have exemptions for essentials. That's something that Ms. Herting-Roo had suggested during the budget debate as well, and Associate Professor Lim has reiterated that proposal. It's, again, one of those things that sounds like a wonderful idea. But you know, the road to perdition is paved with many good intentions. And this is not just from our analysis. You look around the world, multi-tier systems, GST systems have lots of problems. Huge difficulties trying to distinguish between the products. The system is so costly, it's onerous to implement, and it becomes very, very cumbersome. This is not talking in abstract. More recently, I saw a BBC article about the Indian system. Pizza toppings are now deemed not to be classified as cheese. Because why? A fifth of the toppings are made by vegetable oil, and vegetable oil is not considered cheese. So they charge GST at a higher rate of 18% for what they deem as edible preparations rather than at 12%, which is the rate for cheese. And this had to go through the courts, and it was determined by the courts. No end of these sorts of challenges. That's what we have seen everywhere. And the bigger problem behind this is just that besides the administration, the cumbersome, the complication, it's just not effective. It sounds good on paper, but it is not effective because when you examine a basket of goods like essential items, in the end, you benefit the well-to-do because the well-to-do will spend more on everything, not just luxury items, but basic necessities as well. And this is a conclusion not just made by us, it's a conclusion reached by studies, based on studies by numerous governments as well as organizations like the OECD. So we have more than enough evidence to show that this multi-tier system does not work. In fact, according to the BBC report I read, 80% of countries which introduced GST after 1995 have opted for a single rate system, like us, for good reason. So let's not try to come up with ideas that sound good on paper, sound attractive, but in the end we know Not just because we don't like the idea, not just because we are not open to new ideas, but we know from independent analysis done by other countries, done by the OECD, that these ideas, these alternatives, do not work. They are not effective. In fact, we have designed a different system in Singapore, which is, as I described in my first speech just now, also multi-tiered, but it is multi-tiered by income, and it's a far more effective system. Associate Professor James Lim said it was a patchwork of offsets. Well, I think he doesn't give Singapore enough credit. If you look around the world at any GST system, I dare say we are one of the few, if not the only country with such an effective system of GST that has taxed consumption fairly and effectively. Certainly not a patchwork, but a thorough, deliberate design of the GST system to make it fair and effective. So that's a third idea. Fourth idea, why not alternatives to GST, is let's look at other revenue alternatives. Whether it's property tax, personal income tax, corporate income tax. Look at sin taxes. Let's look at all these other revenue alternatives. So we've been through these arguments. We went through them in great detail at the budget debate. I'll go through them again. The problem with these ideas, not because we are not open to them, because we've considered all of them carefully, and in fact, in the budget, we did raise property tax, we did raise personal income tax as well. But the problem with these ideas as a substitute for the GST is that simply the sums do not add up. Why? Let me explain. Again, if I may say, property tax on residential property yields only $1 billion in annual revenue. Today, how much more do you want to get from property tax? We've already raised it significantly this budget for the high-end properties. You want to get more revenues from property tax, you will inevitably have to cover a wider group of property owners, including in the middle income. Personal income tax, we've raised it today in the budget, but if you want to raise more, for example, as I mentioned in the budget debate, if you want to load all of the GST revenue on personal income tax and push it only for the top marginal rates, the top marginal rates will go up from 22% to 42%. Why would the top earners stay in Singapore and pay 42% tax? So again, inevitably, when you talk about property tax, any way to get more revenue will inevitably mean higher rates for a broader group of income earners. Or corporate income tax, for that matter. Yes, there is BEPS 2.0, which may yield more revenue, according to some estimates, but it's really too early to determine how much we will get from the changes in BEPS 2.0, because as I keep saying, there are two pillars in BEPS 2.0, Pillar 1, Pillar 2. Pillar 1 will definitely impact us. Pillar 2 is where you talk about a minimum corporate tax globally of 15%. We may get some revenue there, but we have to look at the combined effects of Pillar 1 and 2. And even after looking at all that, even if we do get additional revenues, the reality is that global competition for investments will only get more intense in this new environment. With geopolitical tensions going up, countries are talking about reshoring, friendshoring, onshoring. What does that mean? Investments come back to my country. And governments are offering very generous subsidies and grants to attract these investments back. Never mind BEPS 2.0 and corporate minimum tax rates of 15%. They are offering very attractive packages to attract these investments back to their home countries. Surely, our jobs and investments will be at risk if we are not able to keep pace and offer equally attractive value propositions in Singapore. So, I've gone through these 4 different buckets of ideas: fiscal surpluses, use more from past reserves, zero rating, multi-tier GST, tap on other revenue alternatives. And I've explained why actually it's very hard for any of them to replace the GST increase. In fact, as I said just now, the GST revenues alone are not even enough to meet our healthcare funding gap. 1.3% of GDP is the gap by 2030, but our GST increase only yields 0.7% of GDP. And this is healthcare alone. We have not talked about social spending. We have not talked about low-wage workers, early childhood, all the other meritorious things we want to do. So really, the question is not GST or these other alternatives, but we need GST and other alternatives. And that's why, from MOF's point of view, we will continue to study all other fiscal options, all other revenue options, and consider how best over time to ensure more resilient and more sustainable revenues for the future. But having explained my position and also gone through all these different alternative ideas, I should say one thing, which is I also take issue with the way that opposition members, especially members of the Workers' Party, have characterized the government's position. Essentially, they have painted a very simplistic narrative that the government has not considered these alternatives, that we are on autopilot, we are not open to ideas, we are just stubbornly pushing away at something we decided to do anyway. But that's completely false. It's completely false. Because we've gone through this already in the budget debate. I've explained repeatedly that in the budget debate that we had thought about all the options very carefully, explained why many of these alternatives are not substitutes for GST. I've gone through them again today. In fact, I've said it's not just GST, all these alternatives. We have to consider so many different options together given our huge funding gap. And I've also explained that we have studied this carefully before we made the decision, the very difficult decision to proceed, both in the budget and after the budget. So this false and simplistic narrative painted by the Workers' Party, which, as Mr. Murali Pillai has kindly reminded us, is not the first time. A pattern of repeating the same arguments against the GST time and again. Really, it does not do justice to the commitment and professionalism of the entire team in MOF, including the public officials who are trying so hard to do what is right and to pursue a strategy of fiscal responsibility and discipline for the benefit of Singapore and Singaporeans. To be clear, the Workers' Party is entitled to your own position. By all means, oppose the GST, adopt a different position, fine. But at least be honest and responsible. Acknowledge that your alternatives will either end up requiring the middle income to pay more, or will use more of the past reserves, therefore denying less for the next generation. And at least have the decency to acknowledge that the government had considered all of these alternatives carefully. We debated them in the budget thoroughly and rigorously before we decided on this move. I would have thought that's what a responsible political party would have done. Unfortunately, I'm very disappointed that the Workers' Party has chosen to take a different path. And I wonder if this is because they feel that this approach is the best way to advance their political agenda, as they have been over the years, to paint the PAP government as uncaring and out of touch. Sir, we have gone through this debate in great detail in the budget debate and now. I can assure you this, that in terms of the process, in terms of thinking about the alternatives, thinking about how best to meet our funding needs, we have left no stones unturned. We have looked at each and every option very carefully. And we have decided this is the best way to manage the fiscal gap that we face and make sure that we continue to keep Singapore's fiscal foundation strong and resilient, especially for the future. There were many members who had supported the increase in GST, but had suggested ways to fine-tune our support schemes, and I have listened to many of your suggestions. I think Mr. Saktiandi Supat and Ms. Jessica Tan asked about the qualifying criteria and administration of the GST voucher scheme. I assure them that we will review the qualifying criteria from time to time to ensure they stay relevant. Ms. Jessica Tan also highlighted a situation where individuals in genuine need miss out on the benefits due to the annual value of the property they live in. And as we have explained, aside from the regular reviews which we do, such individuals may write in and we will consider appeals on a case-by-case basis. Ms. Fumi Ha and Ms. Joan Pereira suggested making it easier for people to understand our schemes and how they benefit. Those who are not sure of their eligibility may refer to the GST voucher website as well as MOF's website and the various press releases that we put out for more information. And we will certainly continue to review to see how we can make information more easily accessible to Singaporeans. I want to also assure members that we keep a close eye on improving the administration of the GST voucher scheme. Most eligible Singaporeans, about 98% of recipients today, get their cash payouts seamlessly through PayNow or direct bank crediting. Those who remain unbanked were previously paid via checks, which required encashment over bank counters, but we have since moved to using GovCash to make payments to these individuals. And we expect this move to help reduce administrative costs and allow the unbanked to receive their payouts more quickly and conveniently. Quite a number of members had shared concerns about businesses profiteering from the GST rate increase, and they raised the need for an effective deterrence. The Committee Against Profiteering, chaired by MOS Loh Yen Ling, takes a serious view of unjustified price increases using the GST as an excuse. So it actively monitors and reviews all feedback on such cases. The committee received about 140 feedback submissions between April and October this year, of which 7 involved specific allegations of GST misrepresentation. They followed up swiftly and found that there were in fact legitimate reasons for the price increases, such as higher cost of raw materials. The businesses involved have committed to be transparent in their pricing and communication with consumers, and so far there have not been any repeat complaints. So the Committee Against Profiteering will continue to monitor this closely, and they will be prepared to publicly name egregious businesses and to take enforcement actions promptly. Mr. Speaker, I have heard many suggestions to delay the GST increase, to consider the different alternatives, and I've explained why these alternatives do not all add up. The Workers' Party and the PSP stance is anything but the GST. But the question is also to be asked, why not the GST, especially the GST in the way that we have designed it in Singapore?
DPM.
The common opposition to the GST.
Order. Leader, would you like to give the suspension of the time limit to speeches?
Mr. Speaker, may I seek your consent and the general assent of members present to move that the proceedings on the item under discussion be exempted from the provisions of Standing Order number 48.8 to remove the time limit in respect of the Minister for Finance speech.
Give my consent as the Leader of the House of the general assent of the honourable members present to so move. Aye. Leader, please proceed.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that the proceedings on the item under discussion be exempted from the provisions of Standing Order number 48.8 in respect of the Minister for Finance speech.
The question is as moved by the Leader of the House. As many as of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Deputy Prime Minister.
Sir, the common opposition to the GST rate increase is that this is a regressive move that disproportionately affects lower-income households. I can fully understand the concerns that such a move will have on lower-income households. But again, this is not how we have implemented GST in Singapore, not at all. I have already explained how, after putting together the permanent GST voucher scheme and GST absorption, we have an overall GST system that taxes consumption in a fair and effective manner. And although we are raising the rate in 2023 and 2024, the majority of Singaporean households will only start to pay more GST nearer the end of this decade or even later. And this is because of the assurance package. The government effectively pays the additional GST on their behalf during this period. A consumption tax, yes, it is regressive if implemented as a standalone measure, but this is not how we have done it in Singapore. We have worked hard to design a system where GST is implemented together with permanent offsets through the GST vouchers to negate that disproportionate impact on lower-income households. And we have also taken great pains to make sure that the middle-income households are looked after, so they only pay slightly more GST, but the full impact of the GST, the full burden, is borne largely by high-income households as well as foreigners based here and tourists. This is how we get the benefits of the GST system, which is a broad-based consumption tax without its drawbacks. What we have is a much, much better alternative than taking more from future generations or significantly raising property or personal income taxes on the broad middle class. It is certainly a more responsible approach than planning on the basis of revenues or surpluses that may not materialize. The unique way we have implemented GST in Singapore reflects the ethos of this government and the way we have always worked. We do not just go for politically expedient measures that may very well end up being unviable or unsustainable. Instead, we focus our efforts on designing effective policies to benefit all Singaporeans. This may mean that the policies are a little bit more complicated. It may mean that we have to work harder to explain our schemes. But it is well worth the extra effort to get it right and do the right thing for Singapore and Singaporeans. Sir, in Mandarin. 新加坡是个迅速老龄化的社会，为了应付我国未来在医疗保健和其他方面的需求，我们需要调高消费税。政府将以公平的方式调高消费税，和帮助所有国人。在定薪与援助配套的帮助下，大多数的本地家庭将能抵消至少5年的额外消费税支出。这表示，虽然我们将在明年和后年逐步调高消费税，实际上，大多数的本地家庭要到2030年左右才开始支付更多的消费税。除了定薪与援助配套，中低收入家庭也能通过永久性的消费税补助券计划获得长久的补助。同时，政府也将继续承担受津贴医疗服务和教育费用的消费税。通过这些方法，较低收入家庭所承担的消费税率比高收入家庭少很多。实际上，平均来说，在政府补贴后，收入最低的10%的家庭完全不用支付任何消费税，这包括许多没有收入的退休人士家庭。 就算消费税调高后，低收入家庭也将继续不受影响。其实，消费税将主要由高收入家庭、游客以及在新加坡的外国人来承担。新加坡是以独特的方式实行了消费税，在征税时照顾了中低收入家庭，这是正确和公平的做法。我深深感激政府和人民之间建立了坚定的信任。多年来，这让我们能推行许多改善国人生活的政策。我向大家保证，政府一定会坚持我们的原则和价值观，继续为新加坡人做正确的事。让我们继续保持对彼此的信任，共同规划前进的道路。Sir, the interests of Singaporeans are at the center of everything we do. No government, no finance minister likes to talk about raising taxes, certainly a tax like GST. But if we have to raise taxes, we will always be honest, transparent, and will do so in a fair manner. And we will always be accountable to Singaporeans that the resources will be put to good use for their benefit. I am deeply grateful for the strong compact and trust between the government and the people. Over the years, this has allowed us to develop and implement policies to improve the lives of all Singaporeans. Singaporeans have benefited from inclusive growth, particularly through our moves to uplift lower wage workers' incomes. Income inequality in Singapore has been on a steady downtrend. We have strengthened social security through schemes like Silver Support. We have strengthened healthcare assurance for all by building 5 new polyclinics and doubling the number of community hospital beds in the last decade. In times of need, such as during the pandemic and during the period of high inflation this year, we have stepped in decisively with measures to support Singaporeans. And now, as part of Forward Singapore, we are working in partnership with Singaporeans to refresh and update our social compact for the next bound. These are but some examples of how we have progressed together as one people and as a nation. So to all Singaporeans, I say, you have my assurance that this government will never compromise on our principles and our values, and we will always do what is right for Singapore and Singaporeans. Let's keep this trust in each other going as we chart our way forward together. Thank you, sir.
Clarifications? Mr. Louis Chua.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If I can have 3 very short supplementary questions, please. I think the first is with regards to this year's fiscal outturn. I think DPM shared that we do not have any surplus this year, but at the same time it's too early to determine, but also at the same time whatever surplus we have is imaginary. Now I recognize that I have limited information, but as I shared in my speech, just based on the first 6 months of the operating revenues that have been disclosed so far, we have a 5.8 billion increase in revenues compared to the year before. So even if we less off the 1.5 billion package in October and 1.4 billion as announced today, would it be wrong to say that there is still some slack, at least based on what is disclosed so far? The second is in terms of the NIRC contribution. Is it wrong to say that the increasing the NIC contribution rate will not result in a decline in revenues? And I think an example would be, as I shared in my budget speech this year, where even if you put into context, the reduction, the drawdown of 43 billion in our reserves for the COVID packages, our reserves today are still higher than they were 5 years ago. And lastly, I think on GST exemption and all, at this point in time, based on my understanding, there are already provision of zero-rated GST for exports of goods and international services. At the same time, there are certain classes of goods and services that are exempted from GST, such as the sale of residential properties and the provision of financial services as well. Thank you.
Sir, on the 3 questions, the fiscal outturn, Mr. Chua only looked at the revenue side of the house. He has not looked at the spending side, which I mentioned just now. Yes, revenues have gone up in the first half of fiscal year 2022, but spending has gone up as well. And as I said just now, overall, the surplus in FY 2021 and the better than expected outturn revenue net of expenditure in the first half of 2022 have already been fully utilized for the packages this year. What happens in the second half of FY 2022, still to be seen. Yes, there may well be some buoyant revenue sources, we'll see. But our spending is also going to be higher in the second half. And net overall, as I mentioned just now, we do not expect a surplus in FY 2022 at the end of the financial year. But we will, at the end, in the budget next year, give a firmer estimate, as we always do. On NIRC, I've also explained our position on NIRC. I've said that going forward, we anticipate that the NIRC, which contributes about 3.5% of GDP to our revenue today, we think that's likely over the longer term to keep pace with economic growth. NIRC will keep pace with economic growth, we think. But this has not taken into consideration the potential for our expected long-term real rate of return to be reduced because of all these structural challenges that we have just been talking about. Climate change, aging populations, geopolitical tensions. So it remains to be seen. But we will continue to monitor and update where necessary. And on GST exemption, yes, there are certain classes of items which are zero rated today, but they are done for very good reasons, including difficulties in collection, and we have kept it to a very, very, very tiny group of items, very small. Look around at all the GST systems in the world. I think ours is we have kept it very, very limited. By and large, most items are taxed on a single rate GST. And if we were to expand the zero rate to many more items, for that matter, to essential items, food, then we're talking about a large expansion of zero rating in our GST system, and all the complications, all the downsides, all the problems, all the ineffectiveness that we have seen in other countries will be experienced in Singapore too.
Associate Professor Jamus Lim.
Thank you, Speaker. So DPM reiterated that he and his MOF colleagues do not believe that it's possible to delay the hike. If I could just confirm my first question that the estimates of impending healthcare needs over the next 2 years are in fact so urgent that they cannot be delayed even for the short run, such that in the absence of the hike, the government will inevitably find itself in a deficit. The second point is to clarify that I was not, in fact, being alarmist in my speech about potential inflationary consequences of the hike. In fact, I clearly explained that the Japanese environment was different, but since DPM is so confident in his claim that there will not be an increase in inflation as a result, I wonder if the government will, in fact, commit to a pause in GST increases to 9% if inflation does turn out to be higher than expected as a result of the hike. And then finally, the point about the multi-tier system, I think the whole point was that we should use the current circumstances as a way to pilot the idea. And I think we've never shied away from talking about how policies need to work for us. And I wonder if he would agree that the postponement of GST on essential items actually affords us this opportunity to test bed this idea.
So on delaying GST, say for 1-2 years, we are doing much better than that. We are delaying for more than 5 years with the assurance package. So I'm not sure why I would want to delay only for 1-2 years, because I can delay for much longer. And with the design of the scheme that we have done, as I mentioned just now, delaying for the vast majority of Singaporeans, but getting those who can pay to pay first. Isn't that better? Second, on pausing if the second step of GST increase, should there be much higher than expected inflation? I mentioned just now the circumstances under which we might reconsider the second step, and that's really in the event of a very significant change in the external environment, globally, and then impacting Singapore. And this has to do not just with inflation, but with the economy, with labor markets. For example, if we were to go into a deep recession next year, it's not in our baseline expectations at all, but who can tell in this uncertain world what can unfold? If something like that were to happen, then as I said just now, we will certainly take a pause to review, to take stock of the economic circumstances and consider our position for the second step. Third, on the multi-tier and the pilots, no, look, don't get me wrong. It's not as though we are reluctant to take in new ideas and to consider pilot schemes. We always do, and we are always open to experimentation and policy reviews. But on this particular case, it's not for lack of studies. There has been considerable amount of work done to look at the effectiveness of multi-tiered systems all over the world by governments, by independent organizations. We have looked at all of these studies. And when the studies are overwhelmingly negative, it ought to give us pause to consider, is it even necessary to pursue a pilot for Singapore's circumstance? Or should we think of alternative solutions? And that's exactly what we have done. We have developed a different system in Singapore. Also a multi-tiered system, but I dare say a more effective multi-tiered system because the GST is tiered by income and we ensure that we can tax consumption in a way that's fair and effective.
Mr. Leong Mawai.
Thank you, Speaker. First of all, allow me to thank the Minister for a very engaging and useful debate today. Maybe this is the second time we are debating on GST in this chamber. Allow me a little bit preamble, just 1 minute. I think, however...
It is clarifications, if you can.
Yeah, 2 clarifications. But before that, let me say one thing, is that the basic differences between the position, at least for PSB and the government, is that we think that the government still did not appreciate enough the financial positions that the Singaporeans are in. They are not just paying taxes, and there are many kinds of indirect taxes. As a result,
Mr. Leong,
let me
please
quote,
proceed to clarifications. It's not an opportunity to repeat your speech
even
again.
when we talk about the NRIC, there are 2 questions we are trying to phantom of this whole money scheme, the fiscal system that the government has on the people. So let me just talk about the NRIC. 2 questions, DPM, please. One is that, what is the share of NRIC? We give 50% of the NRI to the budget, right? So NRIC is the 50%. But what is the share of the NRIC that is not spent in the budget year? 2, there are operating expenditures in the budget. And recently we discovered you have HDB grants, which cost the budget money, the budget deficit, to the budget. And this, in turn, will eat into the NRIC that you contributed, right? So I ask you the second question. Did the NRIC contributed by the past land sales cover the deficit of the HDB grant? 2 questions. Thank you.
So there is no unspent NIRC because the government does not run a surplus anymore, maybe in the past. But nowadays, what surplus are we talking about? We literally are running balanced budgets, if not deficit budgets. So there is no unspent revenue. Every revenue we collect, including through the NIRC, is spent. Second, on the HDB grant, and Mr. Leong says we've just discovered. I'm not sure how he just discovered this. This has been going on for years, since I was a young officer in MOF. We've always financed HDB on its deficit. It's called deficit financing, which means when the HDB has a deficit because it has a shortfall, it has to sell the flats at a subsidized price. The selling price is less than the development cost deficit, and therefore there is a government funding to HDB. This has always been the basis of our system. because we want to assure Singaporeans that they will always be able to afford HDB flats in Singapore.
Mr. Leong.
Speaker, thanks. I've expected the DPM to answer like that. First, on the NIRC, there are a large share of the NRIC being apportioned to funds, right? Just like a few years back, you took 6 billion out of the NRIC and put it in the GST voucher. So that means for that particular year, I think it's 2018, we don't have $6 billion benefit from the NRIC. You know? So one thing that we have been discussing a lot today is that would the DPM commit that in the future, all NRIC will be spent in the current year? Secondly, on the HDB grant, it is, you didn't answer my question. I asked, the HDB grant, like this year, the grant may be close to 4.5 billion, 4.8 billion to cover the deficit of the HDB. So the amount of NRIC that we have put in will be reduced by that amount, right? Because you have to pay for the HDB grant. And besides that, there are other expenditures, which 2 of them I have mentioned in my last adjournment motion speech. So can you answer the question, please?
So I've already answered the question on the second point. The basic point is all government sources of funding, whether from NIRC or from revenue, come into a consolidated fund. We do not hypothecate, which is something that Mr. Leong is saying. Identify this revenue source linked to this particular spending item. That's not what we do in Singapore. All the revenue sources come in because monies are fungible. This is a general pot of funding, and then we spend according to our priorities. And therefore, there is no point going through and identifying these sorts of linkages. On the first point of whether or not there will be unspent funding, it's the same point. If generally we do not believe that there will be surpluses because we are running such a tight ship now, these days. But should it happen, for example, that we have an unexpected windfall in a good year, maybe because of property sentiments, cyclical reasons why revenue has some upside, can it happen? Maybe. From time to time it can happen. Then what is the right response for us to do? Well, if there is that surplus, we might very well consider whether there are longer-term needs in the future that would be prudent for us to set aside some of that surplus into these so-called funds. For example, climate change, adaptation. We have set aside, I think, 5 billion, some figure like that. Do you think we will only need 5 billion for climate change adaptation to protect, to build seawalls and all? Of course not. So in a good year, for example, if we have that extra money, yeah, we will look at longer-term needs and we'll set aside these funds prudently, as we have always done, to manage our fiscal and finances in a responsible manner.
Leader, exempted business, please.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that the proceedings on the business set down on the order paper for today be exempted at this day's sitting from the provisions of Standing Order Number 2.
Question is a motion moved by the leader. As many as of the opinion say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Mr. Leon Pereira.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I just have a few points of clarification. And firstly, I thank the DPM for his replies. And to respond to the Honourable Member, Mr. Murali Pillai, I think there are points of agreement between the People's Action Party and the Workers' Party in this debate. We are not advocating going to debt markets, for example, to finance a deficit, to make the constitutional changes necessary to do that. We're not advocating that. So there are points of agreement, but I think the disagreement is philosophic, and it has to do principally, I think, with the slope of the reserves growth. And we advocate for certain measures that would slow the slope of the reserves growth. And the PAP disagrees with that. We may have to agree to disagree, but my clarification is really on whether the DPM would acknowledge that as countries evolve, societies evolve, and also as the size, the absolute size of the financial reserves increase, different policies are necessary or are advisable compared to when the reserves was 100 billion versus what it is now. And on this point, in this context, I would like to bring members back to the point my colleague Mr. Louis Chua made, that in the crisis of a generation, during COVID, many members of this House used the term the crisis of a generation, the crisis of a generation. We drew down about $50 billion. That is how large is that as a proportion of the reserves? I'm not asking that as a question. I know the government's position on that. But by most estimates that have been circulated, there is a very, very small fraction. So it begs the question, how much is enough when we are at this stage as a society, when we are at this level, this quantitative level of financial reserves? And given that it was 15 years since the framework was last revised, doesn't the minister and the government acknowledge that it behooves us to work on these options at this point in time? So that's my first point of clarification. My second point of clarification is, I wonder if the DPM underestimates the risk of inflation, specifically in regards to this point. When the GST hike comes into effect in January next year, we have all acknowledged that there may be an issue of some merchants using that as an excuse to increase prices more than necessary, and this is common everywhere in the world. It is systemic. We have a committee on profiteering. But I think we should also acknowledge that it's very difficult for any committee in a time when inflation is running at very high levels to sort of effectively address and disentangle legitimate price hikes from profiteering-related price hikes. And in fact, many members of the public may not even raise feedback to the committee because they may think that if certain prices by certain merchants are going up, well, that's just because of inflation, that's not because of profiteering. So from a point of view of practical execution, would the DPM agree that it is very difficult to clamp down on this potential for profiteering, and therefore there is a macroeconomic inflation risk from introducing GST in the calendar year next year? I take the DPM's point that fiscally it is neutral, but there is this other risk of macroeconomic inflation. And my last point of clarification
You can keep the third clarification shorter than the first two.
I think it's, I didn't hear the DPM responding to my colleague, Professor James Lim, on this. So Professor Lim was asking the DPM whether healthcare expenditure, which is usually given as the main reason, for increasing the GST, and that's seeing a secular increase, how much is that going to be increasing in the next few years? And does the rate of healthcare expenditure increase in the next few years, the projected rate, does that require us to require urgency about hiking the GST next year or the year after? Thank you.
So let me take these three questions in turn. First, Mr. Leon Pereira says there's a disagreement with philosophy, and the main disagreement is on the slope of the growth in reserves. I would say the main disagreement is this: the Workers' Party basically wants to use more past reserves and leave behind less for our children and grandchildren. Just state it honestly. Don't need to have fancy words. Slow down the rate of growth of reserves. Basically, you are asking to use more of the past reserves and leaving behind less for the next generation. Fine, that's a legitimate position to have, but is this a wise thing to do? Is it a responsible thing to do? Considering the new global environment that we are in, the uncertainties that we face, all the challenges that many members here have spoken about, is it wise to do it this way? And if you think about it, if our forefathers had taken that same approach, I said in my budget speech or in my roundup speech during the debate, if our forefathers had taught exactly the same line of thought, take 20% more of NIRC for themselves. Today, we will be not just talking about a 9% GST, we'll be talking about an 11% GST. So if we were to do the same, then the next generation, because fiscal needs will continue to grow, they will have to face a greater tax burden, not to mention having fewer resources to cope with crises, emergencies, or anything that can emerge in this uncertain world. And not to mention that we have not even talked about the more than 50 billion which we have drawn from past reserves so far, for which we are very unlikely for now to be able to pay back. And how can one tell whether or not in the coming years there will not be similar emergencies, pandemics, crises, for which we may very well legitimately have to go to the President and ask for permission to use the past reserves. So in light of all of these considerations, I would say we prefer, the government's position is very much to say, today's system, don't change the parameters now. And if we need revenues, we find revenues in other ways that we can do, whether through the GST increase or through other revenue-raising sources. The second point I would say is, in fact, the disagreement on philosophy is not just on reserves, because as Mr. Murali Pillai has highlighted, the Workers' Party has consistently, time and again, throughout Singapore's history, basically, opposed the GST increase. So it's not just a philosophical matter about the reserves, it's also a philosophical matter about the GST. You fundamentally oppose the GST increase. For whatever reasons, I cannot quite fathom, because the way we have designed the GST in Singapore is very different. I've explained this repeatedly. It does not hurt the poor. It is fair, it is effective. It's a unique system, and yet the Workers' Party continues to oppose the GST and the GST increase. And that's why I surmise the only reason why you might do so is because of a political reason, because you know this is unpopular and therefore it serves your political interest to oppose the GST. Third, on the macro inflation risk and the practicalities of tackling profiteering, this is not something we talk about in theory, because we have had experience doing this through repeated rounds of doing GST increases in previous years. And the Committee Against Profiteering, each time we stand it up, has proven to be effective, has proven to be able to deter effectively businesses from profiteering. And when we catch someone, we have been able to take very quick action. So we have confidence in doing these sorts of things, not because of theory, but because of practical experience gained from past rounds of GST increase.
Mr. Leon Pereira.
I'd just like to ask the DPM if you could respond to my third clarification on healthcare expenses and the urgency of introducing GST to meet healthcare expenditure in these few years.
Forgot to talk about healthcare. I've already talked about the projections for healthcare in 2010. That's a projection that we are able to make on account of our aging population. Because, remember, the elderly on a per capita spend basis incurs more healthcare spending than the young. Most of our healthcare spending is incurred when we get older, not when we are young. So just the simple mathematics of it, as our population pyramid shifts to an older population, on that simple mathematics, healthcare spending must surely go up. And that's why we have good basis and good confidence to project in the longer term where the trends are. The only way in which we can avoid that is somehow magically we have older folks spending less on healthcare. I don't know how that might even happen. I hope Healthier SG will pay some dividend, but let's be realistic. Let's be realistic. Even if it helps to slow things down, I think the fact that older folks will incur more healthcare spending, I think that's not going to go away. So the trend is very clear. The upslope is very clear. The only other way to address this is if we are honest, don't spend so much for the elderly. And I'm sure no one in this house wants to take such a position. So that structural increase is very clear, but on a year-to-year basis, next year, 2 years' time, how much more will healthcare spending go up? It's not so clear, because there will be some lumpy investments, there may be a new hospital here, maybe for pandemic reasons we need to enhance our infection controls. So these are nearer term projections, which may be slightly lumpy, a little bit more unpredictable, but the broader trend of increase is very clear, and we have to start preparing now for that increase.
Question is that the bill be now read a second time. As many as of the opinion say aye. To the contrary, say no. Leader of Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Workers' Party would like to record our dissent, please.
Let me state my opinion on collected voices first. I think the ayes have it. Would you like to call for division? Would you like to record your dissent, is it?
Recording the dissent.
Okay. So would members who wish to dissent, please raise your hands. Stand up. Okay, thank you. Would any members like to abstain? Repeat, the question is that the bill be now read a second time. As many as of the opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, say no. No. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Goods and Services Tax Amendment Bill.
Committee stage, what day?
Now, sir, I beg to move that Parliament will immediately resolve itself into a committee on the bill.
Question is that Parliament will immediately resolve itself into a committee on the bill. As many as of the opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The question is that clauses 1 to 20 stand part of the bill. As many as of the opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Bill to be reported. Deputy Prime Minister, Minister for Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to report that the bill has been considered in committee and agreed to without amendment.
Third reading, what day?
Now, sir, I beg to move that the bill be now read a third time.
The question is that the bill be now read a third time. As many as of the opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that at its rising today, Parliament do stand adjourned to 12 noon tomorrow.
The question is that at its rising today, Parliament do stand adjourned to 12 noon tomorrow. As many as of the opinion say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that Parliament do now adjourn.
The question is that Parliament do now adjourn